Imagine a London street at the height of the Winter of Discontent in 1978. Rubbish bags are piled on the pavements higher than a person's height because refuse collectors are on strike. Street lamps go dark according to the schedule of rolling blackouts, and the icy wind off the Thames cuts straight through your cheap coat bought in a sale at Marks & Spencer. Your stomach twists with hunger, and the last few pennies jingle in your pocket, barely enough for the bus fare. In this gray, freezing world, the only source of warmth and life is the dim glow from the window of the nearest greasy takeaway or the thick steam rising from a street stall. British street food of the 1970s had nothing in common with today's hipster food markets. It was food of resistance. Greasy, salty, scalding hot, and often rather suspicious in appearance. In this episode of Britain Yesterday, we'll take the deepest possible dive into the world of street food that fed a nation during one of the worst economic crises in modern British history. We'll uncover why fish and chips were wrapped specifically in old newspapers, what secret ingredient turned an ordinary meat pie into a weapon of mass destruction, and how the first kebabs appeared on British streets, permanently changing the DNA of English cuisine. We'll remember flavors that modern dietitians would call poison, yet for us, they were the only way to warm up and feel alive. If you still remember the peculiar taste of newspaper printing ink on scorching hot chips, you're one of us. Subscribe to the channel so that together we can piece Britain's history back together, bite by bite. In the 1970s, the fish and chip shop, or simply the chippy, wasn't just a takeaway. It was a sacred institution of the working class. At a time when fresh meat cost a small fortune, battered fried fish remained the last bastion of affordable protein. Even here, the poorer classes developed their own cunning survival strategies. The phenomenon of scraps. If you couldn't afford a full portion of cod or haddock, you asked for scraps. These were shards of overfried batter soaked in oil that floated around in the fryer. Owners often gave them away free or for a token penny. Those golden, crunchy fragments were the cheapest way to fool an empty stomach. Newspaper wrapping as seasoning. The true taste of the 70s was the taste of a fresh issue of the Daily Mirror or the Sun. Hygiene regulations of the time still allowed food to be wrapped in yesterday's press. The hot grease instantly dissolved the printing ink, and you literally consumed the news along with your supper. It gave the chips a distinctive metallic tang that simply cannot be recreated today. The ritual of waiting. The queue at the chippy was a place of social exchange. People stood in the dim yellow light of lamps, breathing in the heavy, choking smell of scorching oil that soaked straight into their clothes. The oil in the fryers often wasn't changed for weeks. It took on a dark amber color and such a powerful aroma that boarding a bus afterwards was effectively announcing to everyone, "I've had a treat tonight." If the north of Britain survived on fish, London survived on pie and mash. In the 1970s, the traditional pie shops of the East End experienced their last real heyday. These were places with sawdust on the floor and white tiles on the walls, where time seemed frozen somewhere around the start of the century. A true trial for any stomach, yet completely ordinary for Cockneys, was jellied eels. This dish was the quintessence of Victorian poverty, somehow surviving into the disco era. Cold, slippery chunks of eel trapped in trembling, cloudy jelly. This wasn't food for gourmets. It was pure, cheap protein you could swallow quickly between factory shifts. The peculiar flavor of river mud and sharp vinegar accompanied anyone trying to stave off hunger on the capital's streets. Meat pies were always served with liquor. And no, it wasn't alcohol. It was a bright green parsley sauce, often made with broth from those very same eels. In the dim glow of street lamps, the sauce looked almost radioactive, yet it was practically the only source of vitamins in the diet of a British laborer living on pastry, fat, and potato starch. We ate it by dunking the pie into that green sludge, and to us, it felt like the height of culinary sophistication. By the mid-1970s, British streets were flooded with mobile vans, the prototype of modern fast food, but in the harshest possible form. These were greasy spoons on wheels, parked outside football grounds, railway stations, and pubs. Burgers, the gray disc burgers back then, had nothing to do with today's juicy patties. They were thin gray discs of mysterious composition, often containing less than half actual meat, fried in enormous amounts of the cheapest margarine. The bun was dry and crumbled in your hands, and the only way to make the whole thing edible was to drown it in watery, over-fried onions that had been stewing in their own juices in the corner of the grill for 8 or 10 hours. Hot dogs from a horror film. The same vans sold lurid pink sausages in casings that were impossible to chew. They literally crunched between your teeth like plastic. But when you stood at a nighttime railway station in freezing rain waiting for the last train, that smell of burnt onions and cheap sausage seemed like the aroma of the gods. We didn't ask what it was made of. We just wanted to feel a little warmer inside. The British street food scene of the 1970s also became an arena of cultural collision. With immigrants arriving from Turkey, Cyprus, and India, new aromas appeared on the streets, scents that frightened yet fascinated conservative Britons. Doner kebab was a genuine social shock. Huge spits of meat slowly rotating in the windows of late-night takeaways looked almost alien to the average passerby. But after 11 p.m., when pubs closed and crowds of half-drunk young people spilled onto the cold streets, the kebab became the only salvation. Fiery chili sauce masked less than fresh meat, and shredded cabbage gave the illusion of freshness. It marked the beginning of the end of the absolute monopoly of fish and chips. At the same time, the first stalls selling samosas and onion bhajis began appearing in London and Birmingham. Indian street food was cheap, intensely spicy, and, crucially, always hot. It provided that essential inner warmth in a country defined by damp weather and constant economizing on home heating. Not all street food was greasy and meaty. There was also a seasonal romance, filled with bonfire smoke and burnt sugar. Roasted chestnuts. In winter, vendors selling roasted chestnuts appeared on street corners in central districts. Their tiny homemade charcoal braziers were often the only warm spots in a city frozen by cold. For a few pennies, you received a paper cone filled with hot chestnuts. They didn't so much satisfy hunger as warm your hands through thin, worn gloves. The smoky smell of chestnuts was the official scent of a British Christmas during the era of strikes and the 3-day working week. Toffee apples. Caramel apples were a dentist's nightmare, and dentists were already overwhelmed. The bright red glaze, hard as granite, was full of artificial coloring that stained children's faces for days. It was cheap, sweet, and allowed you to forget, for a moment, that dinner at home would again be nothing but beans on toast. Strangely enough, ice cream vans never disappeared from British streets, even in the harshest winters. In the 1970s, they often functioned as mobile shops in remote working-class estates where the nearest supermarket was miles away. The famous Mr. Whippy, soft-serve ice cream in a wafer cone with a chocolate flake stuck into it, the legendary 99, the quality of the product was beyond questionable. Vast amounts of vegetable fat, sweeteners, and air. But for a child growing up in council housing, it was the ultimate form of affordable luxury. The vans played their rattling, piercing melodies across empty streets, driving adults to fury while sending children into fits of pure excitement. At fairs and festivals, candy floss ruled the day. In those years, it was made on primitive machines, and the giant pink clouds of sugar often stuck to faces and clothes thanks to the damp British air, turning children into sticky pink monsters. It was the cheapest possible sugar rush, and enough energy for an entire evening. By the end of the 1970s, the golden age of wild, uncontrolled street food was drawing to a close. The introduction of stricter European hygiene regulations and the rapid arrival of American giants like McDonald's, whose first London restaurant opened in 1974, began relentlessly pushing out the vans and local stalls. Newspapers disappeared. Oil that had been reused for weeks disappeared. In their place came sterile plastic containers and identical flavors in every city across the country. We look back not because that food was better in a culinary sense. Objectively, it was dreadful, greasy, unhealthy, and often dangerous. But it was part of our DNA. Those burnt edges of cheap pies and cold jellied eels were the fuel that carried Britain through one of the darkest and most difficult periods in its history. We were poor. We were cold in our homes. But on the corner of every street, there was a paper cone filled with hot, life-saving calories waiting for us. What smell of street food from your past will you never forget? Was it the smoke of roasted chestnuts? Or that very first kebab after the pub closed? Write your story in the comments. To us, your memories are more valuable than any official statistics. Subscribe to Britain Yesterday. In the next episode, we'll talk about how Britons spent their weekends in an era when television had only 3 channels and endless static. See you in the past.